Hello all, welcome back. I hope everyone is healthy and doing well. Today we're going to have a review session for our second midterm exam. The exam is going to be next week on Tuesday, April 21st. Everyone is going to get 3 hours to do the exam. The exam is going to be online on Blackboard, and it will begin at the normal class time. It will begin at your normal class time. In other words, it will begin at 10:45 a.m. if you're in the morning 05 class, and will begin at 10 minutes after 3 if you are in the afternoon 07 class. There will be 50 multiple choice questions as with the first exam. And you'll have 3 hours, and it'll all be online. More information will be coming soon. So let's begin where we began after the first midterm exam. We began talking about social stratification. Social stratification refers to a social hierarchy where inequality is maintained and ordered within society. In any society, resources are unevenly distributed. Some people and some groups of people have greater access to society's resources, and other people and other groups have less access to those resources. There are many different kinds of social stratification that are important to understand. The first type of social stratification that we discussed is class. Class refers to groups of people who have the same economic position within a system of economic stratification. One important point to understand about class is you can't just decide to join an economic class. There are larger structural forces which determine which class a person belongs to, as you read about in the very important chapter by Philip Bourgeois. Of course, class mobility, the idea that a person can move either up or down the socioeconomic ladder, is possible. Some identifying markers of class include the ownership of property, the kinds of clothing that you wear, a person's level of education, their professional skills, and, of course, their income. The idea of unlimited upward economic mobility in the United States was popularized in the 1800s by a man named Horatio Alger. Alger was the author of fictional stories about and for young American men that promoted the myth of upward class mobility through hard work. The idea that you can just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. As we discussed last class in our review of the working poor crack dealers that Philip Bourgeois wrote about, this idea of upward mobility is frequently a myth for many people in this country because individuals face both structural and cultural barriers to upward mobility. Closely connected to, but different from, socioeconomic class is the concept of status. Status is stratification based on non-economic qualities. These can include distinctions such as honor, prestige. You can have a position of high prestige without necessarily having a high class position. They can also include membership in an organization or in a religion. Status and class are usually closely related to each other, closely connected to each other. Having high status often also means you have high class. But they are not always necessarily linked. Firefighters in New York City are one example of a working class occupation, not the highest occupation in terms of class, but one that carries a very high status in our society. Increasingly, we hear talk of people who work in grocery stores, for example, during the pandemic, also having a higher status without necessarily getting any more money for the important work they do. Status in society can be either one of two types, achieved or ascribed. Achieved status means that you did some work in order to gain your status. You worked hard to make a lot of money, for example, and move into a higher socioeconomic class. Ascribed status is something that you are either born into, for example, your race or your gender are examples of an ascribed status, or it's something that was just handed to you. Inheriting millions of dollars from your father, like certain politicians we could mention, is an example of an ascribed and not an achieved status. Importantly, and this may seem obvious, but it's been a problem in the past, for something to be an achieved status, it by definition must be an achievement. It has to be something that you actually achieved, meaning that you worked hard for it. You can't just say, I woke up and got dressed today. That's an achievement. I have an achieved status of wearing clothes. That's not an achieved status. Another important type of social stratification is caste. Caste groups are status groups with closed membership, meaning people are born into a caste and have permanent lifelong membership in that caste. People are not free to leave the caste that they were born into and join another caste. So where people can and do move between classes, and they can also move in and out of status groups, people cannot move between castes. The caste system in India is one of the best known examples of caste. In theory, every Hindu in India is born into a jati. Jati is the Hindi word for caste. Each jati has a monopoly on a specific occupation. Some are blacksmiths, some are weavers, etc. And people can only marry within the jati that they were born into. So jati are endogamous. Each jati significantly has a degree of spiritual purity, and the castes are hierarchically ranked, with the Brahmins at the top of the hierarchy. Higher caste Brahmins and other people are not allowed to accept food or water from lower caste people, and the people at the lowest end of the Indian caste system, the so-called untouchables in India, are called the Dalit. Dalit are given the most physically and spiritually polluting work to do: cleaning restrooms, collecting garbage, tanning leather. Dalit do the dirty jobs. And in most places, they are physically separated from the rest of society, though there are now laws in India prohibiting discrimination against them. The jati system in India is one common example of caste stratification, but it is not the only example of caste that we find in the world. Caste is not only found in India. In the United States, race has some similarities to caste because your race is something that you are born into. Your race is something that you can't change, and it is the focus of a lot of discrimination based on a person's ascribed status. Most societies around the world are stratified, meaning that most societies have some level of inequality based on caste, on status, or on class. There are some societies that we call egalitarian societies. These are small-scale societies that lack distinctions of class or caste. They're usually hunter-gatherer societies like the Kong of Southern Africa, and there are not many examples of them left in the world today. Potential categories of social stratification in our own society also include income, age, gender, education, and race. And stratification is often based on many of these things at the same time. Race is a major category of stratification in our society, and this was the focus of our next unit in class. Remember that race and ethnicity are not the same things. Race is a system of classification that divides people based on observable physical differences. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is the sense of historical, cultural, or ancestral connections that are shared by a group of people and that are thought to be distinct from other groups of people. Some examples of markers of ethnicity include food, cultural activities like dances, certain ways of speaking, and other things. The next most important point about race is that race is not a biologically meaningful concept. Race is not a scientific fact, but much like gender or kinship, it turns out race is a cultural construct. This is because, from a scientific perspective, human races do not exist. There's more genetic variation within groups and within smaller populations than there is between larger populations. Race is a cultural category because the physical traits that we use in the United States to categorize people into different races are arbitrary. This is not to say that racial identities are not socially meaningful. Of course they are. We're just pointing out here that race is not a biologically or scientifically valid concept. Racial categorizations are not based on scientific objectivity, but are constructed through culturally specific folk taxonomies. A folk taxonomy is a culturally specific way of classifying things, meaning that different societies will have different folk taxonomies, and different folk taxonomies will classify the same information in different ways. In Brazil, for example, there are up to 7 different categories of race between fully black and being fully white that a person can fall into. These categories in Brazil are called tipos, the same etymology as the word type in English. And to keep it simple, here are examples of 3 tipos that are from the greater number of examples that you can find in the chapter by Fox. To most Americans, the categories of mulata and preta would both be considered simply black. But in Brazil, there is a different folk taxonomy of race that further differentiates what in the United States would be a singular racial category. The important larger point here is that racial categories are culturally constructed folk taxonomies, and they are not universal, objective, scientific categories. However, our folk taxonomies of race have become, over time, naturalized. What does it mean for something to become naturalized? It means that we take a culturally constructed category and make it appear as if it were natural. In other words, as if it were a product of nature, rather than being understood as a product of what it is, which is a product of human culture. And because it is mistakenly seen as natural, the category therefore appears unchangeable and beyond questioning. Whereas in fact, our racial categories that we take for granted right today have changed significantly throughout history. Some of the many ways that folk taxonomies of race have become naturalized in the United States include some of the following things. One idea that helped naturalize our categories of race was the great chain of being, an idea that goes back to ancient Greece. This is the idea that everything in the universe is hierarchically ordered, with God at the top, then the angels, then humans, and with the king at the top, then the nobles, commoners, and then animals, plants, and minerals at the bottom. After our current racial categories were first invented in the 18th century, the different races were added into the hierarchy of the great chain of being, and not surprisingly, the white Europeans put themselves at the top of that hierarchy. It's important to remember that the racial categories we take for granted in the United States today did not always exist. They were first invented in the 18th century and largely did not exist in the early 1600s when the United States was still a colony of England. Racial categories in the United States were first defined in the late 1600s after the Bacon Rebellion of 1676, illustrated here. The Bacon Rebellion was a multiracial rebellion of poor workers who rose up against the colonial governor of Virginia because they thought the governor's policies were unjust. And the rebellion was importantly done by the descendants of both Africans and of Europeans. The Bacon Rebellion tried to overthrow the governor of Virginia, but they failed, were defeated, and one result of this failure was the passage of laws for the first time that legally separated the descendants of Africans from other members of the colony. So racial categories at this time began to be written into law. The new laws also favored poor white settlers for the first time. Racial identities in the United States were then further solidified with slavery and continued to be so after slavery. One way this was accomplished was through the idea of hypodescent, which is also called the one-drop rule. Hypodescent works by defining a person with a single drop of black blood as being fully black, which, as you will recall, this is a very different definition of race and racial difference than what we find with the commonly accepted folk taxonomy in Brazil, for example. This idea of hypodescent was instituted in the laws in the southern states as a form of social control in Jim Crow America and further solidified our racial categories and our way of thinking about race in the United States. Moving into our next unit, which was on the anthropology of religion, we began with one of the earliest attempts to define religion, which was made by the 19th century armchair anthropologist Edward Tylor, who defined religion as a belief in supernatural beings. Three types of action that are commonly associated with religion are prayer, sacrifice, and pilgrimage. A prayer is a request made by anyone to a god, a deity, or a spirit person. Sacrifice is similar to prayer, but it involves an offering made to a deity or a spirit, and in the process of making that offering, what is given over is usually damaged or destroyed. Pilgrimage is a sacred journey that carries a pilgrim to a place with special meaning or power to that person. Some important examples of pilgrimages that are religious in nature are the Hajj, which is the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, pilgrimage to the Western Wall in Jerusalem for Jews, the Stations of the Cross for Catholics, or if you live in Europe, Catholics make pilgrimages to the shrine in the chapel in Lourdes, which they believe has special healing or curing powers. There are also many different categories of religious specialists, people who hold special positions or perform special acts that ordinary people are not capable of performing. One is a priest. A priest is a person who mediates between their congregation and a god or a spirit being. A shaman is a person who communicates with and also exercises some direct control over unseen spirits. This is usually done for the purpose of asking those spirits to help heal people who are sick. Spirit mediums are similar to shamans, but instead of controlling the spirits actively, they are specialists who are controlled by the spirits. They allow the spirits to enter their body, and while passive, they allow the spirits to speak through them. This is also done for the purposes of healing the sick and also of obtaining information that people want to know. Next, we discussed the category of magic and how magic is both similar to and also different from the category of religion. Magic refers to techniques and strategies that people use to gain control over external events. It is often done through spoken spells or the use of objects, and is usually done to gain some benefit for the person who's doing it. So we find magic to affect the weather, magic for success in farming and hunting, and also love magic, to name just a few. The similarities between magic and religion are that both have beliefs, both involve the use of rites and rituals, and both have ideas of good and evil, ideas of right and wrong. And both magic and religion can be used to address the problems and uncertainties that people face in their daily lives. As the readings put it, both magic and religion address the universal human need to minimize uncertainty and insecurity. This is something that both magic and religion share. One important point of similarity between magic and religion is that magic and religion both involve the use of ritual. Ritual is a patterned, repetitive, and symbolic act that is used for controlling unpredictable events or for changing the status of people, like in a wedding or also in a funeral. Remember that ritual is importantly an activity that is set apart from the normal routines of daily life. Ritual and routine are not the same thing. Brushing your teeth every day, for example, is not an example of a ritual because this is something you do every day. This is just a routine, and routines and rituals are importantly different. We read about the baseball players and their use of magic. They also deploy what we call taboos and fetishes as part of their rituals to achieve better results while playing baseball. A taboo is a ritual prohibition, something that you are ritually not supposed to do. Taboos can be temporary, like not eating certain foods for certain amounts of time. Maybe some of you decide to give certain things up for Lent if you're Christians. Other taboos are permanent, for example, the incest taboo. Fetishes are objects that are imbued or are believed to have supernatural powers. For example, a lucky rabbit's foot, an object that many people believe will, for some reason, bring them good luck. One thing that is missing from the Baseball Magic article's discussion of magic and of ritual is the idea of symbolism. Symbols are words and things that stand for or represent something else. And we see a couple examples of symbolic action in the Baseball Magic chapter. For example, not stepping on the white chalk of the foul ball line, which is a symbolic avoidance of hitting foul balls, or of not crossing the bats, which is symbolic of not being able to hit the baseball. These are some secular examples of symbolism that are in that chapter. Symbols are also importantly religious, and in religious symbols, there is what we call a duality within symbols. In other words, religious symbols have two poles, which were identified by the American anthropologist Victor Turner. At one end of this polarity is what Victor Turner called the sensory pole of the symbol. The sensory pole is the part of the symbol that connects to our emotions. The symbol has an emotional meaning or connection for people, and this is found in the sensory side. At the other end, symbols also have what Turner called an ideological pole. This is the part of the symbol that connects the symbol to important social values that people hold in the society where the symbol is relevant. So we can see this polarity in, for example, the Christian cross. On the sensory pole, the cross symbolizes, on an emotional level, a connection to the passion of Christ. We see the cross and we imagine, if we're Christians, I'm not, his suffering up there on the cross, the passion of Christ, and this has an emotional connection to us. On an ideological pole, the cross symbolizes and has a connection to the value of Christian sacrifice, one of the important values of that religion. Turner also stressed that symbols are what he called multivocal. This means that each symbol has a range of different meanings, and that each symbol could represent multiple meanings or even conflicting meanings to different people, or that the same symbol could be interpreted differently by different people. In other words, there is not necessarily one fixed meaning to any symbol. The meaning of symbols needs to be interpreted, and different people can give different interpretations to the same symbol. In the article by Evans Pritchard, and also the movie we watched about this in class, we learned about another category related to religion, which is witchcraft, and specifically about the belief among the Azande people of Central Africa in what they call mangu, which is what we customarily translate as witchcraft in English. Mangu for the Azande is a substance found inside a person's body that makes a person what we would call a witch. The mangu flies out physically from the person to bewitch its victim. You can have mangu and not know it, and it makes the people around you sick and generally is believed to cause misfortune in Azande society. Mangu is discovered through the process of divination by consulting an oracle. An oracle is a shrine or some other place where a spirit or a deity reveals some hidden knowledge. The process of seeking information from an oracle is called divination. Divination refers to obtaining information by so-called magical means which have, importantly, no apparent empirical connection to the information that you are seeking. What was the most important oracle that the Azande used? The most important oracle that the Azande used is called Benge. This is the poison given to the baby chick, which you all saw in the film. The poison oracle is used to answer specific yes-no questions. They also consult other oracles, such as the termite oracle, which you also saw in the film. The Azande used these oracles to determine, among other things, who is afflicted with mangu, and therefore who is what we would consider to be a witch. Now, belief in mangu might seem strange or irrational to us, but there is a very more or less solid logic behind this belief. What larger question does the Azande belief in mangu attempt to answer? In his chapter, Evans Pritchard has a famous example in the reading of the granary that collapses on two people while they're sitting underneath it. It was a hot day. There were some people trying to escape the hot sun by sitting underneath the granary, and it collapsed. They got injured. And according to Zande thought, this is an example of mangu, of witchcraft. Why? Because mangu attempts to answer the question, why did these two things happen at the same time? They know why the granary collapsed. It's because termites were eating at its supports. They know why the guys were sitting underneath the granary. It was a hot day. The Zande want to know, why did those two things happen at precisely that same time? For us, in our own Western epistemology, our explanation for this unfortunate event would be merely coincidence. The guys sat underneath it at the same time that it collapsed. Just because they were unlucky, it was a bad coincidence. But for the Azande, there is no such thing as coincidence. The Zande do not believe that coincidences exist or can happen, and so they need another explanation. Mangu provides this explanation in the absence of accepting that coincidences can happen. Turning our attention back to magic for a second, we've already asked the question of what the categories of magic and religion have in common, and we found that they have several things in common. Now we have to go back and ask, what then are the important differences between the categories of magic and religion? And to help answer this question, we turn to the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. Durkheim argued that the major difference between magic and religion was that religion unifies a group into a community that has a church. But for magic, Durkheim argued, there is no church of magic. Magic instead has a clientele, meaning magic has a number of customers for the service that it provides, but it does not have a larger community organized into a church. Now, when Durkheim says that religion has a church, by this Durkheim means by a church, he means a moral community. Magic, on the other hand, is not united by a moral community. And because magic does not have this moral character that Durkheim claims religion does, it therefore cannot be the basis of a greater social solidarity like religion can. Turning our attention back to ritual, we learned about a specific kind of ritual in the article by Victor Turner on liminality and communitas. Liminality is the second stage in a three-stage ritual process that are called the rites of passage. That's rites of passage. Rites of passage begin with a person or group of people being separated from an initial stage of being. They then pass through what is called a liminal stage and ends with their reincorporation back into society from the liminal stage. One important function of these rites of passage is that they change the status of people who go through them. So when people are reincorporated back into society after going through a liminal phase, which is a very ambivalent phase where they're separated from society, the people have gained a new and usually a higher status than what they had before they went through the rite of passage. The liminal stage is marked by ambiguity, what Turner calls being betwixt and between. It's marked by a loss or lack of status for the people going through it, and usually by some removal from society. The liminal stage is also marked by what Victor Turner calls communitas. Communitas is like a sense of community, but also involves a sudden feeling of group cohesion where we find a loss of ego among the participants. Examples of rites of passage and liminality in our own society include going to college. Every one of you in college is in something of a liminal phase between your previous lower status life as high school students and the future life we hopefully will all have after all of this for you as college graduates. Going through boot camp in the Army or going to prison are also other examples of being in a liminal phase betwixt and between two different statuses, the before and the after. We had another ethnographic case study of religion with Rachel Mueller's article on boyfriend spirits in Senegal, where we also see another example of ritual. In Senegal, as elsewhere in the Muslim world, there are what are known as Sufi sects. These are mystical sects of Islam where people strive for inner spiritual perfection, among other things. Sufis believe in many different types of spirits. Some spirits that are helpful to people, others that can cause people harm. The harmful spirits include what in Senegal they call the Faru Rab, who are boyfriend spirits who possess young women. These spirits, the Faru Rab, are believed to desire relationships with attractive young women, so the spirits enter their bodies and possess them, causing the women to act in irrational and sometimes in violent ways. Illnesses that result from the Faru Rab are an example of what we call spirit possession. Spirit possession is when a person becomes possessed by an unseen spirit. The spirit takes control of that person's body or takes over their personality and causes them to act irrationally and to become ill. Spirit possession is different from being a spirit medium. Spirit mediums are religious specialists who become possessed usually after inviting or asking spirits to enter their bodies, and this is done in a very controlled ritual environment. Spirit mediums do this in order, it's believed, to gain answers to specific questions that they believe the spirits can answer, and they also try to heal people who suffer from illnesses also caused by spirits. There are some important gender differences between spirit possession and spirit mediums, in addition to these other differences of how they work. In most societies that have these beliefs, spirit mediums, the people who invite the spirits to enter their bodies, can be either men or they can be women. It's open to either gender. However, in societies where we find spirit possession, the people who tend to suffer from this the most tend to be women and not men. Women suffer from spirit possession more frequently than men do. This is because we usually find spirit possession in contexts and in societies where women have relatively little power compared to men, in societies where women are comparatively powerless. In this explanation, spirit possession, where the possessed woman temporarily loses control of her body, becomes a culturally approved way for the woman to rebel or protest against her own marginalization, and thus to temporarily gain some control over her life. How is this the case? Because by losing control through the temporary possession episode, women are also temporarily absolved of responsibility for their actions and are freer to protest their marginal position in society. By becoming possessed, as we saw in the Senegal example, women also gain the attention and the resources of several different people. One is from the Marabout, who are Islamic holy men who can offer their help and support to women who are possessed by Faru Rab spirits. They also get the attention and the care of what's called an Ndepkot, who is a female ritual healer and one of the few positions of authority available to women in Senegalese society. The Ndepkot performs rituals to appease the spirits and help heal the woman of her spirit possession. The details of this are found in the chapter by Mueller. Mueller also draws a distinction at the end of her chapter between what we could better call world religions and local religions. Islam, in this case, the Senegalese case, would be the world religion, and Faru Rab, boyfriend spirit possession, would be an example of the local religion. How is it, Mueller asks, that the local religion and the world religion can continue to coexist with each other? The two can coexist, Mueller argues, in situations where the world religion and the local religion explain different problems at different levels. The world religion tends to be more successful at explaining the bigger problems that people face in life, like mortality, death, illness, and the fate of one's soul. The local religious belief, on the other hand, addresses more day-to-day problems, like why did I trip and stub my toe? Why wasn't I successful in the hunt? Why did the granary fall on my head? Mueller's argument about local and world religions is also echoed in the film on Azande witchcraft that we watched. We only watched the first half of that movie in class, but if you watch that film, go back to it and watch it all the way through. That movie makes a similar argument to the one that Rachel Mueller makes in her chapter. Finally, for our section on religion, very briefly, there is the chapter by Rudnitsky on Islamic finance in Malaysia. Rudnitsky tells us how Islamic finance is different from conventional Western capitalism. The answer basically is that Islamic finance prohibits the payment of interest. It also promotes risk-sharing and profit-sharing agreements rather than transferring all risk onto clients, which is something more characteristic of Western capitalism. This article also is a nice segue to our next segment, which is on the economy. After religion, we moved on to discuss the relationship between economics, the economy, and culture. One act that is central to all economies is the act of exchange. And there are three major categories of exchange that are found in different degrees in different economic systems. These three are market exchange, redistribution, and reciprocity. What defines market exchange? In market exchange, goods and services are bought and sold. In other words, goods and services are traded in exchange for money. The goods that are bought and sold are called commodities, and the economic interactions in market exchange are depersonalized, meaning that no lasting social connections or social bonds are built or are expected to be built in the economic transactions between people exchanging commodities. Redistribution is where goods or money are collected into a central fund by a central authority to be reallocated within the group. Taxes are one obvious example of redistribution, but taxes are not the only example of redistribution. We can also find redistribution in hunter-gatherer societies and in systems of exchange like the potlatch. The third form of exchange is called reciprocity or reciprocal exchange. This is the exchange of resources, of goods, or of services done as a way of creating and reinforcing social bonds between individuals and between groups of people. Reciprocal exchange, unlike market exchange, is generally based on the giving and the receiving of gifts. There are three types of reciprocal exchange: generalized, balanced, and negative reciprocity. Generalized reciprocity is where there is a close relationship between the people exchanging things. The value of the gift given is usually not calculated by the giver before they give it. What is given back in return is not predetermined, and those who give do not expect an immediate return, although they do expect some return in the future. Generalized reciprocity often takes the form of long-term trade partnerships between individuals or groups. Cronk, in his chapter, writes of the Kong system of trade called Huxaro, where people form trading relationships, taking turns, giving things to each other over many years. In balanced reciprocity, the relationship between the people exchanging things is not as personal as we find in generalized reciprocity. It tends to be more institutionalized, and the sense of indebtedness, the sense that I have to give something back now that you've given me something, is more openly acknowledged than what we find in generalized reciprocity. Both balanced and generalized reciprocity function to create and maintain social relationships. Negative reciprocity, on the other hand, is where both parties in an exchange try to get back more than they give in the first place. Negative reciprocity is more likely to occur between strangers or groups that are otherwise hostile towards one another. There are no lasting social relationships between the people engaged in negative reciprocity, which more closely resembles commodity exchange. Negative reciprocity is also similar to barter. Barter is the exchange of goods for other types of goods or services. Where there is no money involved, it's an immediate exchange. Barter is much closer to market exchange than to any of the forms of reciprocity that we've discussed. Generalized reciprocity involves the exchange of gifts. Gifts help create lasting social relationships by establishing mutual obligations between the people exchanging the gifts. When someone gives a gift, there is almost always an implied expectation of a return gift at some point in the future. One major difference between a gift and a commodity, besides the fact that a commodity is exchanged for money, is that unlike with commodity transactions, repaying or returning a gift must be deferred into the future. Must be deferred into the future. It can't be immediate. An immediate return of the gift, you give me a gift, I immediately give you something back in return, makes the exchange feel more like a commodity transaction Remember, in a commodity transaction, the exchange has to be immediate. If you want your bagel from the coffee shop, you have to give them the money right away. Immediate return of the gift also implies that the social relationship involved between the two people will not be a long-lasting one. It will not be a relationship that stretches into the future. In his book, The Gift, the famous French anthropologist Marcel Mauss argued that in gift exchange economies, the gift contains a kind of force or spiritual power that compels people to give something back of equal or greater value in return. The Maori of New Zealand, there you can see New Zealand on the map, that's Australia off to the left of it there. The Maori of New Zealand had a name for this force. They called it the hau, H-A-U, of the gift. The hau for the Maori is a spiritual or perhaps a psychological force that compels a person to repay a gift. And this force can cause a person harm if the gift is not reciprocated in the future. Mauss then discusses the three obligations of the gift. The first is the obligation to give. You cannot refuse to give other people gifts. It's something that you have to do. Next, there is the obligation to receive, meaning that you cannot reject a gift if it is offered to you. You have to accept it. Finally, there is the obligation to reciprocate, meaning that when you receive a gift, you must give something back again in the future. Next, we learned about the potlatch, an activity to which the three obligations of the gift also apply. The potlatch is a competitive feast where the object is to either give away or destroy more wealth than one's opponents. The potlatch proper, where we get the name from, was found among the Kwakiutl people and an indigenous Native American group in British Columbia, there on the map. Similar systems of exchange are found elsewhere in the world. For example, the mocha of the highlands of Papua New Guinea, which you already watched the movie about. In a potlatch, the leader of a host group invites a rival group as guests to a large communal feast. The host then tried to give away as many valuable goods as he possibly could to the guests of the potlatch. By giving away large amounts of wealth, the leader gains status and gains prestige. The leader who earned the highest status through the potlatch was therefore considered to be the political leader, the person who was entitled to be the leader of the people. So the person who could give away the most was seen as the most legitimate political leader. Cronk tells us in his chapter that the word potlatch means to flatten, and the goal was indeed that. The goal was to bury your rival with your generosity, with how many gifts you could give. As an economic system, the potlatch is a combination of redistribution and reciprocal exchange, and as a system of reciprocity, it has elements of both balanced and negative reciprocity. Balanced because it's a very formalized, institutionalized exchange where the debt was openly acknowledged, and negative because valuable goods were often destroyed by a leader, leading a potlatch to become a kind of festival of competitive destruction. Marvin Harris, in his article, gives us 3 reasons that explain the potlatch as a system of exchange. The first reason he gives us is the nature of authority in societies where we find the potlatch. These are non-state societies where rulers do not have the authority to give people orders. They can't just order people around. The only power they have is the power of persuasion. And we see this very clearly in the film Onka's Big Mocha. The second explanation that Harris gives is related to productivity. Systems of redistribution like the potlatch function to get people to produce more goods than they ordinarily would. Harris argues that the potlatch creates an incentive for people to produce a surplus that otherwise is not there. The third explanation Harris gives is ecological. Potlatch and similar systems equalize annual or seasonal differences in productivity between different areas, different environments, or different microclimates. Harris, in his article, which you should read, also gives us a new understanding of the Christmas in the Kalahari article, which we read before the first midterm. That article where the Kung Bushman once again ridiculed the anthropologist Richard Lee because he was being boastful about giving them an ox, a story we've now heard many times. Harris reinterprets this story using the logic of gift exchange. Ridiculing Lee's gift of the very large meaty ox which he gave to the Kung was a strategy by them to diminish any expectation that they would give a similar gift back to Lee at some point in the future. Why would they do that? Because according to the logic of reciprocal gift exchange in pre-capitalist societies, and according to the 3 obligations of the gift, if someone gives you a big meaty ox, you must reciprocate and give them something back in the future of at least equivalent value. And the Kung simply didn't want to do that with this dude. Finally, we discussed the important chapter by Philip Bourgeois, his ethnography of crack dealers in Spanish Harlem, right here in New York City. I gave a detailed lecture on this in the previous video, so I don't think it's worth repeating all that here again. I do insist that all of you please read this article. In a nutshell, the article asks, why do the working poor Puerto Ricans of Spanish Harlem turn to dealing drugs? Rather than blame individuals and individual behavior or psychology, Bourgeois teaches us that the causes of social problems like dealing drugs are importantly both cultural and structural. On the structural side, the loss of over 500,000 factory jobs in New York City means that there are now fewer decent-paying jobs available to the working poor. On the cultural side, dealing drugs offers greater dignity and also greater personal freedom than working in a terrible, low-paid office job. I'm going to stop there. I'll send you more information about the exam soon. Please email me if you have any questions. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everyone is safe and healthy and that all your families are safe and healthy. Stay safe, stay indoors as much as you can, and hang in there. I'll talk to you soon.